and they're going to work through your family and the ones you love the most. So you basically have less and less contact with them unless they start to come to workshops and want to express their interest in joining the group. And so there's this process of the group wanting to isolate you more and more so they can have more and more influence over you. And if the family and friends aren't supportive, or they raise red flags and questions about it, then they're labeled as the enemy or suppressive people or satanic. In my former cult, my parents were my physical parents, but Moon and his wife were my true parents. And I started sleeping 3 to 4 hours a night and prayed for 2, 3, 4 hours a day and recruited people and indoctrinated people and went out raising money, doing political demonstrations, whatever I was told to do. And my life became more and more narrow, and all of my real self that was a creative person, a poet, a writer, got suppressed, and I was a very, very good Moonie, and I was promoted up pretty high for an American in a relatively short amount of time.
Do cult identities have common characteristics?
Do cult identities have common characteristics? I would say yes, in the sense that cult identities are typically very elitist. They think they know the truth, or that they're more spiritually evolved than anybody else. They're typically very black and white, and us versus them, and good versus evil. Of course, if you're in, you're good, and if you're out or criticizing the group, you're evil. It's interesting, there was a study that was done with a Bible cult, the International Churches of Christ, by a psychologist named Flavel Yakeley, and he did a study and ultimately was published called The Discipling Dilemma. And he administered the Myers-Briggs personality inventory on 800 members of this particular cult. But he did something very creative. He asked them to not only fill it out, but imagine filling it out before they joined, and imagine how they would fill it out 5 years staying in the church. And from a normal distribution of 16 basic personality types before everybody got into the group, it all converged on one personality type, which was in the image of the leader, Kip McKean. And so he talked about cloning and how a personality type was created. He went on to do the experiment with a number of other cults, and they all were not exactly the same personality type. They were mostly all extroverted, if my memory serves me, kind of super salespeople type. But the bottom line is you got to be like the leader. And the more you're like the leader, the more praise you're given and the higher you're promoted.
I have noticed certain personality attributes with those who've been involved with the Scientology organization. I'd just like to share these with you.
Please.
Habitual speculation. Social immaturity. Encourages socially immature behavior. Baseless prejudice against sociology and psychology. Interpretation of and responses to ideas and experiences in terms of Scientology. During their time in Scientology, they assume the role of co-perpetrators of their own victimization. And dismissal or denial of facts that conflict with the position of the organization or subject of Scientology. I welcome your comment on those.
I agree with everything you've said, but I don't really think of it as a personality feature, what you've just listed off, but rather attributes of the cult personality, identity that people are indoctrinated to have.
All right, so these are, and I think that's what I meant was these are something that they acquire. It's difficult unless you've known that person before they were recruited. Mm-hmm. To be able to compare the two. But this is just something that's a common characteristic, like a Scientology identity that is created or that is induced, that person is induced to create.
Mm-hmm. One thing that's unique, that's very interesting about Scientology, and for that matter, any group that is a clone of Scientology, and there are many, many of those, is that it's an organization that's very power oriented, and they promise people powers and that they'll be smarter and that ultimately they'll be have godlike powers. And that's very different from the Unification Church, the cult that I was in, where the idea was to be one with God and to create a ideal world, and which Scientology also says they're going to create an ideal world, but it's not so power oriented. It's more love oriented or sacrifice yourself for others oriented. Whereas this notion that, come in and you'll be able to control matter, energy, space, and time, and you'll be able to communicate with anyone about anything at any point. Of course, once you're in, you're not allowed to communicate with anyone about anything if it contradicts what the belief system is of the group. But one interesting thing that I'll share is that because I can't tell you how many cult members I've met in 35 years who say, I'm not under mind control, including myself. And in order to really prove that, what I think people would need to do and be able to do convincingly is step into the shoes of a critic, especially a former member, especially a former leader, and be able to articulate without joke and without distortion what their point of view is. So what I'm trying to say is that former members can tell you what the group point of view is articulately and eloquently and accurately, but until a member of a group can actually sit and listen and digest what a former leader has to say or a former member has to say and be able to repeat that back, I would argue that that person is not free in their mind.
Something related to this, I want to read a paragraph from your book. I'm in chapter 2, where it says, what is destructive mind control?
Mm-hmm.
Looking at a group's attitude towards information is the fastest way to evaluate whether it is using destructive mind control. A legitimate organization will allow people the freedom to think for themselves, read whatever they like, and talk to whomever they choose in order to arrive at their own decisions, whereas a destructive mind control group will want to do the thinking for people. You care to expound on that at all?
Well, I still is my point of view, and I would say, in addition, that a legitimate group, especially if it's claiming to be a spiritual group, will stand up to scrutiny. It will stand up to its critics. It will engage in a back and forth dialogue and debate, and will demonstrate that what they say is what they mean, and what they say they do, and there's no hypocrisy, there's no contradictions. I say that when a group says we're better than anybody else on earth, we're doing something so special and so unique, and we have the highest level of scientific knowledge from the key to human freedom and the key to curing cancer, the burden of proof is on them to prove it and not on everyone else to disprove it. And again, if a group's legitimate, it will invite critics, it will have public debates, it will go over the facts, and if their behavior is found to be wanting, they will make real changes and, of course, put checks and balances in so that abuse of power will not take place. And the destructive cults do not want this at all. In fact, I do agree that information control, well, let's look at dictators. Dictators don't want a free press. They don't want dissidents going on the internet, writing things about them. So they're going to try to kill them or round them up or shut off the internet. And it's been a major problem in the United States for destructive cults, because the first thing people do when they wake up and get out of a mind control cult is think about all their friends who are still in there and want to prevent other people from getting suckered in. and they go on the internet and start sharing their experiences. And cults hate that because they want to control the information.
You mentioned in your book, and this is still in chapter 2, what is destructive mind control, the model developed by Kurt Lewin, the process of unfreezing, changing, and refreezing, which was also used, it was adopted by Edgar Schein in his book Coercive Persuasion, which is a book that I've also read as well. Could you explain to our listeners in a little more detail, elaborate on Kurt Lewin's model of thought reform?
So basically, when I first got out of the Moonies in 1976, Robert Lifton's Thought Reform and the Psychology of Totalism was the book that was used in my intervention. I had fallen asleep at the wheel of a fundraising van and drove into the back of a tractor trailer truck at 80 miles an hour. And being in the hospital away from the group, I called my sister, who said, "Come and see your nephew and me, that he was born, and I want him to know his uncle." Anyway, the long and the short of the intervention was I was given a paradigm about what brainwashing was about. And Lifton was an Air Force psychiatrist who had been commissioned in the 50s to find out what Chinese communist brainwashing techniques were all about. And in his Thought Reform and the Psychology of Totalism book, he outlined 8 criteria that any environment may be judged as a thought reform or a brainwashing environment. And it opened my eyes to the reality that that's exactly what the Unification Church, the cult that I was in, was doing. And it opened the door to me stepping back and reassessing all of the experiences that I had had from another perspective, that maybe I had been brainwashed. And of course, there was overwhelming evidence that that was the case, because I was a leader in the group and I had stuffed so many unethical things that had happened and things that I had experienced. And I just started on a quest to read everything I could about brainwashing and mind control. And the immediate first people that I read was Edgar Schein, who was another former military intelligence person studying Chinese communist brainwashing, and Louis Jolyon West and Margaret Singer. So this model of that Schein cites of Levine is basically you assault the person's identity, you disorient them, then you indoctrinate them, and then you refreeze the new identity. And what I think was lacking in that was the dissociative dimension, that there's a cult identity that suppresses the person's real identity. And later, Lifton wrote a book called The Nazi Doctors, in which he was basically investigating how people who were sworn MDs to uphold life could do a lot of the horrendous, unethical experimentation on women and children, as well as men, during the Nazi era. And he basically talked about a concept that he called doubling, which is essentially exactly what I'm talking about, this dual identity, where the people's real self, they could go home and be great, family men and be honorable and loving and kind, and then go to work and carve people up without anesthesia, and do all kinds of horrendous things. But I guess what I want to say for your listeners is that we've come a long way in our understanding about influence and the human nature and the human condition. And we know a lot more about hypnosis, for example, and altered states of consciousness. And now there's more and more functional MRI experiments that are being done as well. And I must say, groups like the Unification Church and Scientology were using so many of the essential techniques to break people down and build them up in their image and